So the South, since 1980, every single presidential election has voted for a Republican incumbent, right? So, starting with Ronald Reagan and going all the way to the present, it's always been Republican. As a matter of fact, the last Democrat president to be elected in the South was their own Jimmy Carter, who came from the state of Georgia. So this kind of gives you a bit of an indication that, the South would be very, very heavily Republican. And actually, if we look at a snapshot of just the 2020 election, just to give a bit of an indication, we can see that 131 out of 160 electoral college seats, would have gone to the Republicans. So this represents about 82% of the electoral college for the South going towards the GOP. However, on the flip side of this, the non-South would be even more skewed towards the Democrats. So without all these southern states, which tend to vote Republican, the North would basically be made up of largely Democratic states. And we can see this in the fact that in the last election in 2020, the electoral college vote for the Democrats in the non-South would have been 277 to just 378. So this represents about 73% split towards the Democrats. However, something to bear in mind, again, because the Electoral College really skews things in one way or the other, it's a thing where the actual fact where it comes to the population, it would be predominantly Democrat in the North, but it wouldn't be as heavily skewed as the 73%. So, the Electoral College, it kind of makes sense in the sense of, the whole of the United States coming together, and it kind of roughly balances it out. However, when we split up by regions like this, I think that the Electoral College, both in the North and the South, would very quickly be disbanded, because it would be so clearly skewed one way or the other that I don't think it would really last for very long. But something to note is that obviously, for depending on when this happens, the further back in history that this happens, the more divergence there's going to be between the two cultures, right? So just to keep this video very, very simple, because we've already kind of done a video on what if the South won the Civil War. So we're gonna assume we're going to assume that basically the split between North and South in this timeline is much more recent. Certainly, let's say that it happens post the civil rights era, right? Just to kind of keep it really, really simple, because if it happens in the 1960s or before the 1960s, the issue of Jim Crow segregation is going to be really, really prevalent, and as such, Jim Crow would probably exist into the 1980s, if not the 1990s, because basically an apartheid system. Apartheid in South Africa lasted up until 1994. So, if it existed in the South at that point, it probably would have continued to at least the 1990s. So we're not gonna really touch on that, because in the last 50 years or so, there has been a great deal of progress within the South with regard to racial issues, to the point where there's not now that much difference between the North and the South in terms of attitudes to race. The South has made a lot of progress in that regard. So race, although it is an issue within America more generally speaking, it's not anywhere near as stark between the North and South as it once was. So race wouldn't really play into much of the politics here, although it does play into the fact of black people tend to vote for the Democrats and white people tend to vote for the Republicans. So maybe if the voting patterns were still consistent along these kind of racial lines, maybe then that's how the politics of it would manifest itself. But for the most part, I think that the main difference between the South in the current timeline and the South in this timeline would be the fact of the South is obviously the Bible Belt. This is where you have evangelical Protestantism being in the ascendancy, absolutely dominant there, and so a lot of the different state legislatures in the South have tried throughout the last few decades in particular to impose some sort of not Christian theocracy in that kind of sense. It still obviously would be a democratic kind of system, but they've tried to impose certain things which under the US Constitution they're not able to do because of this separation of church and state. They've wanted to push certain things both in the schools and in the courts, etc., which the US Supreme Court has struck down because they said that it's unconstitutional. However, without the US Supreme Court having jurisdiction over the South, more likely than not, what would happen is that many of the southern states would be able to be more free and go towards having more Christian, explicit Christian doctrine imposed on the states. And most notably of all, we would see this in the case for abortion rights. You know, so obviously the famous case of Roe v. Wade in 1973, this legalized abortion across all 50 states, regardless of whether the majority of people in these states want it or not. And so I think more likely than not, if the South was to split away from the North, Roe v. Wade would very quickly be overturned and abortion would either be made illegal or it would be greatly restricted in nearly all of the Confederate states. And you can pretty much see this with pretty much every other like kind of social issue in America, yeah. Whether it's whether it's abortion, whether it's gay marriage. For instance, the U.S. Supreme Court had to impose like kind of gay marriage on all of the states, regardless again whether they want it or not. And I know that the polling on this is quite old and stuff because things probably changed now. Like kind of like the majority position is probably now in favour of gay marriage in these states, but as of like being able to find like the polls on this, yeah, we find that majority of people in the states of Alabama and in Mississippi were still opposed to the concept of gay marriage at the time at which the Supreme Court struck it down. So while obviously social attitudes do change, it's something to note that the South in particular would be much more socially conservative when it comes to issues like to do with like tradition and all these kind of things, right? On the flip side, the North would be a lot more socially liberal than the current United States is, and obviously, the South would be a lot more socially conservative than the current United States is. Yeah, the North would be. The way to think of it would be that it would be slightly to the right of modern day Canada. So it'd have a lot more like welfare spending than currently is the case. But at the same time, its economics would be slightly to the right of Canada, and so things like kind of universal healthcare might happen eventually at some point, but it's not. Especially in those early years, it still would be a lot of the kind of like status quo being maintained and stuff. But then obviously the South would be, much further to the right, as we said, and would be, more focused on like states' rights. It'd be more focused on, well, obviously it's a confederacy, so it'd be much less focused on kind of like the federal system that you currently have, which is more centralized and more in favor of like big government and like kind of like welfare spending and stuff. So it's kind of something to bear in mind here, that like both the North and the South, like depending on when it diverges, even if, let's say for instance like the North and the South diverges today, you'd see that like as time goes on, the two cultures would become more and more different. Like the systems of government would be more different, the economies would become different. So that's something to really bear in mind. And also, realistically, I think that the political parties as they currently exist would also diverge as well. I don't, for instance, think that as the current Democratic and Republican parties are made up, I don't think that they would kind of exist in this time. I think that, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party of the South would become, more right-wing as such, right? You might even see the creation of new parties to kind of like replace the old one, because like in the South, why would they kind of continue with this old kind of like Democrat-Republican kind of system? And on the flip side, in the North, again, like the Republican Party, if it were to exist, would become a lot more socially liberal, as would like the Democratic Party. But then again, more likely than not, like the parties would change. Like you'd probably have different parties being created that would better reflect the situation both north and south of this new border. So it's kind of something to really bear in mind, that like depending on when this happens, or like if ever this was to happen, it's the thing where, as things currently stand on the ground, the further like along the road that you kind of go, the more of a diversion that there would be and stuff. So that's something to really kind of bear in mind.